Ladies and gentlemen, let us ground this assessment in the cold, hard reality of history and geopolitics so we do not get lost in the chaotic noise of the current news cycle. When I look at the situation unfolding in Venezuela, I am reminded of the tensest days of the Cold War, where the collapse of a regime or the capture of a dictator was never the end of the story, but often the beginning of a much more violent and unpredictable chapter. We have seen this script play out in Panama and in Iraq, and now it is manifesting right in the backyard of the Western Hemisphere. What we are witnessing through this 90-day emergency order from the Venezuelan government is not merely a legal response, but the guttural growl of a mortally wounded beast, a survival reflex of a ruling apparatus in absolute panic following the capture of their supreme symbol of power, Nicolás Maduro. History has taught me that there is nothing more dangerous than a dying dictatorship that still retains control over guns and courts. This decree, with its draconian language about hunting down and capturing anyone supporting the United States attack, is effectively a smokescreen for an internal purge and a tightening of the vice around a civil society that is already on its knees. We must not be naive enough to view this as an attempt to restore order. Rather, we must see it for what it truly is: the industrial-scale legalization of repression, where the line between national security and the survival of a political faction has been completely obliterated. The brutal truth we must confront right now is that the legal system in Caracas has been entirely weaponized to serve the purposes of retribution and power consolidation for the remaining power brokers. When Delcy Rodríguez, who has stepped into the role of interim leader, declares that this decree is effective immediately and sends it to the Supreme Court, she is not following a democratic process, but activating a machine designed to crush all dissent. The most alarming aspect is not what is written in the text, but its calculated ambiguity, particularly the fifth article, which allows police forces to arrest any person suspected of promoting or participating in the recent incursion. In the intelligence world, we call this a blank check that allows the regime to fill in any name they wish to eliminate. A WhatsApp message, a complaint on social media, or even silence at the wrong moment can be construed as supporting the American attack. This is not justice. This is wide-scale psychological terrorism designed to paralyze the will of the people. Analysts in Washington or at the United Nations may debate the legality of this document because it has not appeared in the official gazette, but for the person on the streets of Caracas, bureaucratic legality is meaningless when a barrel is pressed against their head. We must admit that in this chaotic context, real power lies with the man holding the rifle, not in the legislative procedures we are accustomed to in Western democracies. Drilling down into the layers of this decree, I am particularly concerned about the formalization of the role of armed groups in civilian clothes, known as the colectivos. Previously, these groups operated as the unofficial enforcement arm of the regime, doing the dirty work that the regular police might hesitate to touch, but now this new order has granted them authority nearly equivalent to law enforcement. Empowering the collectivos to detain people and search phones at checkpoints is an incredibly dangerous step, effectively turning a paramilitary force into judges and executioners on the street. This signals the desperation of the interim government, suggesting they no longer fully trust the absolute loyalty of the regular military or police and are forced to rely on their most fanatical loyalists to maintain order. This is a classic sign of a regime cannibalizing itself from the inside, where suspicion pervades every rank of command. The biggest question haunting the Venezuelan leadership right now is not how to fight the United States, but which one among them betrayed and handed over Maduro. This mutual suspicion will lead to brutal internal purges, and the emergency decree is the tool they will use to execute them under the guise of national defense. When a government grants unlimited power to vigilante militias, they are sowing the seeds for an undeclared civil war where violence becomes decentralized and impossible to control. From an economic and strategic perspective, the decree mandates the militarization of the oil industry and public services, a move that sounds decisive but is essentially old wine in a new bottle. Constitutional lawyers and experts in Caracas have pointed out that military control over these industries has been happening for a long time, and the new document merely formalizes the reality on the ground. However, we must view this through the lens of realism. Handing a technically demanding industry like oil extraction over to military management has never been a recipe for economic success. It is invariably a path to corruption and inefficiency. This creates a direct and sharp conflict with the promises coming from the United States regarding the return of oil corporations to repair the badly broken infrastructure. We cannot expect Western capital or technical expertise to flow into an environment where assets can be seized and personnel can be arrested under martial law at any moment. The contradiction between President Trump's commitment to reconstruction and the reality of militarization in Venezuela is a chasm that no simple diplomatic solution can bridge overnight. The interim government is using national resources as a hostage, willing to sacrifice long-term economic interests for short-term control, a mindset characteristic of regimes backed into a corner. Moving to the pragmatic prescription, I must be blunt. There is no silver bullet for this situation, and anyone promising a quick fix is lying to you. The United States and the international community must be extremely cautious to avoid walking into the provocation trap the Caracas administration is setting. By criminalizing support for the U.S. attack, they are baiting us to create martyrs and ignite extreme nationalism. Our response should not be empty military threats or blind economic sanctions that hurt common people more than the ruling elite, but rather precise intelligence focused on the specific individuals running this apparatus of repression. We need to identify exactly who is giving orders to the collectivos, who is signing the arrest warrants, and target their assets and their ability to move. Simultaneously, the diplomatic message must be consistent. We are not against the Venezuelan people or their sovereignty, but against unconstitutional abuse of power. However, I must also warn about the limits of American power. We cannot impose our will on a nation in the grip of collective paranoia without accepting the risk of getting bogged down. The wisdom of a great power lies in knowing when to act and when to let the internal contradictions of the adversary play out. In this case, the internal suspicion regarding who sold out Maduro may be the most potent weapon we have, stronger than any Marine division. Ultimately, the burden of all these geopolitical calculations, as is always the case, falls squarely on the shoulders of the innocent. The decree gives Delcy Rodríguez the power to close borders, restrict movement, and ban assembly, effectively turning Venezuela into a giant prison. We are talking about millions of people trapped between the crossfire of international sanctions and the brutality of their own government. The image of civilians being stopped by armed gangs in plain clothes, having their phones searched, and being detained for a mere text message is a painful reminder of the cost of freedom and the fragility of social order. When we sit in air-conditioned conference rooms in Washington discussing strategy, we must not forget that every decision, every delay, or every intelligence failure is paid for in blood and tears by ordinary citizens. The responsibility of a leader, whether in the White House or the Pentagon, is to see through the fog of war and politics to the human beings suffering behind it. That is why I always emphasize caution and realism, because when politicians make mistakes, soldiers and citizens pay the price. In this ruthless chess game in Venezuela, America needs a cool head and a steely heart to navigate the storm, not to win a war, but to prevent a total humanitarian catastrophe that is waiting to explode. Digging deeper into the current power structure, we need to rigorously analyze the role of Delcy Rodríguez on this chessboard because she is not just a temporary placeholder, but the representative of a hardline faction rising from the ashes of the Maduro capture. Her appearance in the public address immediately following the seismic event and her steely declarations about defending natural resources indicate a carefully prepared political messaging strategy, even if the reality on the ground is chaos. However, that surface level confidence cannot hide the deep fractures within the leadership apparatus. Western intelligence analysts have expressed significant doubt regarding Mr. Maduro's signature on that emergency document, raising the question of how a man in the process of being captured could sign such a complex administrative decree. This detail is not trivial. It is a massive legal and political vulnerability, exposing the desperation of the interim government to maintain the continuity and legitimacy of power. If that signature is forged or coerced, then the entire legal basis of the current regime is a castle built on sand. We are facing a scenario where deception is not just a propaganda tool, but has become the legal foundation of the entire state. This poses a massive challenge for any future diplomatic efforts because how can we negotiate with a partner whose very basic legitimacy is a giant question mark? Look at how the Venezuelan propaganda machine is operating in parallel with military measures. The decree targets not just physical action, but the information space itself, allowing arrests based on mere suspicion of promoting the attack as a preemptive strike against all forms of dissent. In the digital age, the war is fought not just on borders, but on social media platforms and messaging apps. The regime understands perfectly well that information is the most dangerous weapon that can collapse their control. Therefore, empowering the collectivos to check citizens' phones is not just about finding evidence of contact with the U.S., but about instilling absolute terror, forcing the population to self-censor. This is a classic but highly effective psychological warfare tactic. When every citizen fears that their neighbor, their bus driver, or even their own phone could be the eyes and ears of the state, collective resistance is broken. We must understand that their goal is not to arrest every opponent that is logistically impossible, but to make a few brutal examples to deter the masses. It is the logic of rule by fear, and it is being deployed systematically right before our eyes. Another aspect that demands dissection is the contrast between the Venezuelan government's rhetoric and its actions regarding sovereignty. They endlessly harp on protecting national sovereignty against imperialist American aggression, yet this very decree strips the Venezuelan people of their agency over their own country. When public services and strategic infrastructure are placed under military control, ordinary citizens cease to be owners of their nation and become subjects ruled by martial law. The military, whose function is to protect borders, has now turned its guns inward to manage the distribution of electricity, water, and gasoline. This leads not only to the inefficiency I analyzed earlier, but creates a new privileged class within the military, those who hold the keys to the economy and live in comfort while the rest of the country drowns in poverty. This is a model of the gangsterization of the state, where loyalty is bought with access to resources, and corruption becomes the only lubricant that keeps the machine running. As someone who has spent a lifetime studying security, I can assert that a power structure based on such resource partitioning is incredibly unsustainable, especially when oil revenues are plummeting and international embargoes are strangling the economy. Returning to the question of United States strategy, we must face the reality that promises of American oil companies pouring billions of dollars into Venezuela to fix infrastructure are a distant prospect, if not a delusion, as long as the current power structure persists. No CEO in Houston or New York will risk shareholder capital in a place where laws are rewritten overnight by an emergency decree and their employees can be taken as political hostages at any moment. Therefore, our policy cannot rely on simple economic seduction. We need a multilateral approach, coordinating closely with allies in Latin America who are most directly affected by Venezuela's instability. Colombia, Brazil, and other neighbors are bearing the brunt of a massive refugee wave, and they have the strongest incentive to see a stable Venezuela. Instead of acting unilaterally like a clumsy giant, the United States should play the role of consensus builder, providing intelligence and logistical support to neighbors to create collective diplomatic pressure on Caracas. Only when the interim government feels total isolation from its own continent will they be forced to reconsider their calculus. Finally, I want to reemphasize the human element within the Venezuelan leadership, specifically the wounded beast psychology. The people currently holding power in Caracas are not acting based on common sense or long-term national interests. They are acting on survival instinct. They know that if they lose power, they face international tribunals or brutal retribution from their own people. Consequently, they will fight to the bitter end, regardless of the consequences. The suspicion regarding who betrayed Maduro will be a slow-acting poison, killing their internal unity. We will see purges, mysterious disappearances of high-ranking officials, and constant shifting in the command structure. This is the most dangerous phase, but also the regime's most vulnerable. Our mission is to observe with patience, gather precise intelligence, and wait for the moment when the internal cracks become too wide to plaster over. Do not intervene clumsily and accidentally restore their unity by creating a common external enemy. Let paranoia and greed do the work of destruction. That is the art of power. That is the behavior of a mature and prudent superpower.